Riley Mulvey and Evan Bronze lead a comeback against Washington. Yeah, that's where we are into this year's Iowa men's basketball team. We break it down today, plus talk with Scott Dochterman, Locked On Hawkeyes.
You are Locked On Hawkeyes, your daily podcast on the Iowa Hawkeyes. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, welcome in. I'm Trent Condon, and this is the Locked On Hawkeyes podcast. Thanks for making Locked On Hawkeyes your first listen every day. We're available wherever you find podcasts. You can also watch us on YouTube. While you're there, hit the subscribe button. Just takes a moment and helps us get in front of more Hawkeye fans. Today's episode of Locked On Hawkeyes is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Great time to get in on all the action. Football's in the rearview mirror, but we got a ton of basketball. And right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Iowa wins against Washington in comeback fashion, down 9 in the second half. The Hawkeyes come roaring back and get the victory over Washington. It's the game we talked about going in, an absolute necessity. If Iowa was going to be making the Big Ten tournament, this is one that they had to put in the win column, and they do just that, coming back and getting the win 85-79. Some heroics in the second half. You start with Payton Sandfort, and we talked about it after the devastation, the loss on Oregon. You could see it on his face. You could see the tears coming out of his eyes, the frustration, knowing that he came back for a senior year that he anticipated was going to be a lot different. And I think all of us thought this one was going to be different. We could argue if they thought they were going to be an NCAA team, but I thought they were wrong on that account. However, I thought they would at minimum be a bubble team, right? They'd be a team at this point in the season. We'd still be talking about a realistic path for them to be an NCAA tournament team. And with what's in front of them in the final 4 games, I guess you could look at it. If you're one of the positive types, right? If you're one of the people that looks at things maybe in a better light than I normally do, you say, look, they got 4 opportunities in front of them. All 4 of these games would be huge resume building wins. You see Illinois, they get absolutely demolished on Saturday night against Duke at Madison Square Garden. And Duke's great, but this Illinois team, when they're bad, they're really bad. It's a house of horrors, but who knows? Maybe it's another one of those crappy performances from Illinois. You go to Northwestern, that's banged up. You get Michigan State at home. You finish up in Nebraska. All those games are difficult. However, Payton Sandfort goes off. Josh Dix goes off. We've seen it before. Now you're still talking about a minimum winning 3 out of 4 in order to make that happen. I think it's more realistic as opposed to winning 3 out of 4 that Iowa loses all 4 of these games. But again, the positive light is there, but you had to win this game. That is the start of things. Now, I believe Iowa probably has to get one more victory at minimum to secure their spot in the Big Ten tournament. As we've talked about, 3 teams are not going to make it. It'll be just the top 15 out of the 18-team league that will get there. Mentioned, though, back to Payton Sandfort. We've got to get back to his play. And there was a couple of moments where shots were a little bit off. This dude's out there, though, plays all 40 minutes of the game. 27 points, 9 rebounds, couple of assists in a game where Iowa had to go deep into the bench. Traore gave them absolutely nothing. Drew Thelwell continues to be lame with that ankle injury. You could just see physically he's not there. Josh Dix finished with 15. Again, need to see him more aggressive, just 10 shots. And the way this team is constructed, you need more, but it was the bench play from Carter Kingsbury. Not only hitting a 3-pointer, that was great, but the defense that he was playing and giving up so much size and strength inside. And he was battling in there against those Washington bigs. Obviously, Evan Bronze, who had a great game the game previous against Oregon, he was there, had a nice and one and a big bucket for Iowa in the game, in there mixing it up, playing defense. You had Riley Mulvey. And the reverse layup will be remembered for a long time. Maybe, hopefully it does not go the way of the John Licklider bucket against Purdue, and I don't think it will. But that reverse layup, and when Dix threw in the pass, in a way you can almost see, oh boy, that Dix thinking, oh man, as he's going to reverse style, but he finished it off, smile on his face, taking the charge. It is a great moment for Riley Mulvey. This is not going to be a season that we're going to be bouncing our grandkids on our knees talking about, right? That's not what this is going to be. It's been a disappointing year. and likely a frustrating end to the Fran McCaffrey era. But those little moments, and the moments like that, Riley Mulvey has busted his butt for this program for the last 3 years. And the development has not been at the level that I'm sure a lot of people wanted to see. Coaching staff, fans, maybe even Riley himself. But he didn't pout. He's out there, he's engaged, he's into the game, knowing that most nights he's not going to be out there. But he's a great teammate. And to have those kind of moments, it was wonderful to see. It really was. And something that makes you happy, certainly as a Hawkeye fan, to see those kind of moments. Overall, a game that was a must win. Washington's not good. There was a couple of stretches in that game where you could just see this was two below average basketball teams going up against each other, right? But Iowa comes back, and it was a good crowd on hand. At least sounded like a good crowd. Here's one thing I want to leave you with. And we're going to be talking with Scott Dochterman. We got a lot of Iowa football to get into. The Big Ten as a whole. He was down in New Orleans for the meetings with the SEC and the Big Ten, so he's got a lot of great insight to that. We'll talk some basketball as well, but plenty of football talk coming up here momentarily with Scott Dochterman of The Athletic. I want to leave you with this, though. We mentioned the Final Four games. Iowa, well, they'll be on the road for 3 of them. There's one game left at home against Michigan State. So here comes Tom Izzo. He's got another good team this year. No surprise. Iowa's had some recent success against Michigan State. And as we sit and ponder and wonder and speculate about what is going to happen at the end of the season, is Fran McCaffrey going to retire? Is he going to be pushed out? Are they going to give him another season? Is there going to be caveats that there needs to be changes in the staff? Whatever it turns out to be, regardless, one way or the other, there is a very real possibility, though, that this is Fran McCaffrey's last game as the head coach of Iowa, at least for the regular season at Carver-Hawkeye Arena. And if that's the case, can we get a good crowd on hand? I'm putting my money where my mouth is. I got 2 tickets to the game. I'm taking my son. He went as a little kid before, but the first time that he is really engaged in Iowa basketball. He's 5.5 years old. He loves the Hawks. He tells me every game that the Hawkeyes are the bestest, and I'm going to break him. And it's just going to be me and him, going to be a boys trip over to Iowa City. We're going to make our way over. We're going to go Carver. We're going to make it happen. And we're going to go watch the Hawkeyes play. And maybe it'll be Fran's last game. Maybe it won't, but it'll be Payton Sandfort's last game. And for what this guy has done and the will that he has put into the program, the tears that he shed, the blood that he's gone into it, this guy cares. Let's fill it up for an Iowan. Let's fill it up for a good dude. Let's be there, all as Hawkeye fans. And let's make this a good environment for Michigan State. And if Iowa gets blown out, so what? Have a Carver cone. Enjoy one final time at Carver this season watching this men's team. And maybe the final game for Fran McCaffrey. As Hawkeye fans, let's all do this together. It's my plea to you. You get tickets cheap. Get in there. Support the team one final time here as we'll flip the calendar into March. Couple of games before that, but needed this one and a tip of the ball cap. Comeback looked like they were left for dead a couple of different times, and everybody stepped up in a way. Everybody gave them minutes. Everybody gave them an opportunity to come back in this game and get it done, and love to see that. The bench minutes that they got from Mulvey, from Bronze, Price Sandfort had a couple of shots in there. Mentioned Kingsbury playing 29 minutes. That's where we are. 29 minutes from Carter Kingsbury, a walk-on. Riley Mulvey played 15, 10 out of Evan Bronze, and they got out a victory in the Big Ten against Danny Sprinkle. What a name. And the Washington Huskies. Scott Dochterman talking Iowa football, Big Ten football, and a little basketball as well, plus a big weekend coming up at Carver-Hawkeye Arena. How about the Sunday that we have in front of this, starting with the women's game against top 5 UCLA, and then the nightcap on the wrestling mat with Oklahoma State in town. Should be a good one. We'll talk about that as we continue Locked On Hawkeyes. Today's episode of Locked On Hawkeyes is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you place live bets throughout the game. So even if you miss the opening tip-off or just want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can combine your live bets into a same game parlay. I love using FanDuel's live betting feature because it keeps every moment more exciting. How about that comeback for the Hawkeyes? You could jump aboard, get some good plus money on that one in the game on Saturday. Plus, the app is super easy to use. When you win, you get paid instantly. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Scott Dochterman normally joins us on a weekly basis on a Monday, but he had travels, not vacation travels. No, it was work travels down in New Orleans. And Doc normally here, oh boy, rough work trip, right? Got to go to New Orleans and chase things down. But it wasn't New Orleans as we normally think. You had some cold weather down there.
Yeah, that was really unfortunate. And I know people don't want to hear about it, but I know walking to the airport when I was on Tuesday morning, and it was, in Cedar Rapids, and it was -10, and the wind chill was -25. I'm like, sweet, I'm going to New Orleans. Well, it rained the first day, and the second day I was indoors working, and then third day before I left, it was like 30 and wind chill of 18. I'm like, everybody there was blaming me for bringing it down. So I guess we'll win some or lose some. Yeah. Pretty much the trip there.
Well, the trip there was about maybe very important part of what we're going to see going forward with college athletics, the continued putting together of the SEC and the Big Ten, seeing if they can find common ground, and more than anything, the control that they exert right now in college football and the structure of what this thing's going to look like with the college football playoff. So let's start kind of the headline item, the college football playoff. I think that's where most people's kind of minds are going with this. What you learn and what you anticipate after these meetings, what the college football playoff is going to look like starting after this next season.
Yeah, there was no official word as to how it's going to come down, except for we know that it's almost a certainty it's going to expand. And part of that is after this year, the Big Ten and SEC pretty much run the show afterwards. It doesn't have to be a consensus. It's pretty much those two taking control of it and everybody else going for the ride. And I think you're going to see it 14 or 16 teams. And there are some people who do want it to be 16. They figure, why go to 14? Let's just rip off the Band-Aid and go to 16, which, could be the case. And then I think you're going to see, a certain amount of qualifiers, probably in the neighborhood of 4 per league at the Big Ten and SEC levels. And then, whatever they decide or what gets decided at the ACC and Big 12 and so forth down the road. And so that to me is probably what is going to happen. It wasn't the future wasn't as discussed as much as the House settlement, certainly, or the situation with this year coming up. They do want some changes when it comes to seeding. I don't know that they'll get it because they have to have a unanimous consent as opposed to what happens in 26. So I think going forward, you're going to see an expanded playoff in 2026 with guaranteed spots for the Big Ten and SEC, probably in the neighborhood of 4 each. And that could, so we could be a year away from high level football games continuing.
So, Doc, the reason, as I was reading through this proposal and what it's going to look like, 14, 16 teams regardless, the thing that I think bothers me the most is the automatic bids, the 4 for the SEC and the Big Ten, and not that they get the automatic bids in a certain way, but how it's going to diminish what non-conference scheduling looks like, what the games actually matter on the field. If it's all just about finishing in the top 4 or even top 6 and then getting a potential path to get to the playoff, non-conference scheduling, non-conference games, the Iowa State game will never mean anything really in the grand scheme of things. Again, that really bothers me.
I don't think that's the case, Trent. I think it's going to be based on what you do in your conference, not what you do out of your conference. So
that's what I'm saying, though. If that's the case, it doesn't matter who wins Iowa State, because all that matters is what you do in your conference.
To get to the playoffs, sure, but I think to the fans it matters. And right. When you're talking about the difference in most years between a 9-3 or 8-4 season or 7-5 or going whatever. I think that those games still are important. They're going to be important to the seeding of the games, but I think in some ways you're going to see this be much better because instead of worrying about, well, I can't schedule that opponent because we might not have it. It's a coin flip game and we, might not be able to go to the playoff because of it. Now you're going to play that game because it's like with college basketball to some extent, and you're actually going to get a chance to, to play a game that the people are interested in, that will watch, that won't crush you. So the example I use, because the Big Ten and SEC are considering, I don't know that Nebraska and Tennessee will be playing each other anytime soon, but beyond them, some sort of a sharing agreement or playing agreement is, what if Iowa and South Carolina play and they're both 7-2 in their leagues, and they play, it's a coin flip game, one way or the other. They play in Charlotte, they play it in Chicago, whatever. And the team that loses now could be on the outside looking in. So why would they want to play that game? But instead, if they play that game and the result doesn't matter, ultimately, that's good for everybody. You get to see better games. Otherwise, they're going to be scheduling a Mercer or Eastern Illinois or whatever, because those games don't matter. So I think it's I look at it on the other side of the point, Trent.
And from an Iowa perspective, this is a great thing, though. This is a great thing knowing that there's years that you just look up and say, how in the world, in an 18-team league, how is Iowa going to be able to finish in the top two just to get into a championship game? Well, now, if it plays out where you got the top two teams playing for a championship, 3 seed versus 6 seed, a 4 versus a 5, Iowa would have had a path last year to a playoff. And we know that wasn't your typical playoff team, certainly a year ago. For Iowa football, I think this is a great thing.
For sure. I think it's really interesting because it gives more teams the opportunity to have relevant seasons. And you bring up Iowa from last year. I don't think anybody would suggest that they looked the part of a playoff team, but still, they would have qualified with a 6-3 record in the Big Ten. They would have played Indiana, which would have been the 3. Had they beaten Indiana, then they would have qualified for the playoff. They would have played their way in. And I think that's, rather than what we saw, which was a 54-yard field goal against Iowa State, almost completely drop them out, and then losing to Ohio State on the road, it left them with basically a miracle to try to get into the playoffs. In this case, they have a chance to continue to play all the way through the end of the season for an opportunity to get to that number 6 seed and play. And in the SEC, there's discussions of going 8 deep. So it's going to be a really fascinating discussion as to how that all weighs out. But it's an extra round of conference football, and it'll be right now. It looks like the first weekend in December if that goes through. And it's hard to say if that's going to be on campus or if they decide let's just have one big weekend in Indianapolis or another neutral site. So, but it's speculative, but I think it's really fun and to entertain the prospect.
Let's go to another avenue from the college football playoff to the NCAA tournament. Obviously, the biggest moneymaker for the NCAA. We know the amount of revenue that creates, and football is a different animal in the way the NCAA structure works. What about the possible expansion? Was that brought up? Was that on the table? And I think with these mega leagues, something probably the Big Ten and the SEC both want, right? More access for the bigger leagues. And even if it's a play-in round, an extra round of that, another 4-8 games, are we heading down the path of a bigger NCAA tournament?
Well, that was not brought up, but it is very likely it's going to be either 72 or 76.
Okay.
And it's been discussed both ways. I think most fans, it's kind of funny, don't want any kind of expansion when it comes to the NCAA tournament, but I think you're going to get it. And it's just a matter of it's going to be 4 or 8 teams more. But no, basketball, unfortunately, was not discussed down there. And in the past, they have their first summit. They did discuss chances for maybe replacing some of the early exempt tournaments that these teams go to, and like, say, the Cayman Islands or Cancun or whatever, and instead doing something more on the mainland against one another where they get to keep the revenues instead of farming it out. I think that's something that you could see in the future between the Big Ten and SEC. But they were really concentrating on the 2 main areas, which were the CFP which was more interesting than the House settlement, which people don't really want to hear about, but is very, very important.
It's the important part, but let's explain it. The House settlement part, and we're still trying to figure out just the way this is going to look. So kind of take us into that avenue. It's not the most exciting, but like you said, Doc, it's incredibly important for the future of college athletics.
Yeah, it's the most important thing, because we are talking about, the ability for athletic departments to share revenue with their athletes and how much. And we're about 6 weeks away from the actual settlement being finally approved, and there will be additional appeals and lawsuits being filed. That's definitely going to happen. But beyond that, I mean, they're all the ADs and the league officials were kind of trying to figure out ways to make it work. Now they stopped short in a lot of areas because of collusion. They can't say, hey, let's everybody agree to 70% for football. No, you do that and you're back in court. So they had to be very careful in what they discussed, but largely, how they get to generate that revenue, and which is why I think, the Big Ten is looking into private equity and some other ways. It is the fascinating development out of this. And so $20.5 million is what it's looking like for this fall. Iowa's going to pay it. I talked to Illinois. They're going to pay it. Most schools in the Big Ten are in the same boat. I don't know about some of the others. And I assume the SEC is in the same way. So it is the most important topic really related to college athletics right now.
How that's going to go. You had an article up earlier today on The Athletic, and it is predicting which Friday night football games are going to be there. Of course, Iowa this past season, they took on UCLA in that Friday night game. You have the traditional Black Friday matchup against Nebraska. I remember hearing you, I can't remember if it was on a podcast or just us talking, but you said this has taken a little bit more work than you kind of anticipated going in, trying to figure out what these Friday night football games are going to look like.
It's really difficult. And I did ask the Big Ten and just for a couple of things just to make sure I wasn't completely wrong. And because there's a limit to what these teams can do, which is one home game, one road game under the Friday night Fox umbrella. Iowa is a little different because it doesn't have home Friday games except for Black Friday or Labor Day weekend. And then because of the hospital situation, but it does have the ability to play two road games on Friday. So it's a little bit different. Michigan will not play Friday. And then you have games like Penn State, Ohio State, and Michigan, which are sought after by the other networks for their Saturday packages. So they can't really go to Friday because, they're not going to, if NBC would like to draft a Penn State, Michigan game, they're not going to let that go to Friday night. So there's just so many different factors, even more so than trying to predict which game's going to end up at prime time on a Saturday. And then so many different times I'd try something and it would always end up wrong. So, and I'm sure as I kind of joked with the guy who handles the scheduling for the Big Ten, I said, I probably make one wrong move here and the whole thing will go down in flames. So, but I had Iowa going to USC in prime and on a Friday night, and who knows if that'll be the case, but it's something I worked through.
So speaking of that, when do you think we're going to start to see the trickling out of some of the start times? In the past it was May, there were some April ones that came out. It feels like it's a little bit different, but when do you anticipate this year we're going to start to see some of those kickoff times start to trickle out?
There'll be a couple that probably come out, I'd say in April. Last year they released the Friday ones in May, mid-May, and then the first 3 weeks, which come out in wholesale right around around Memorial Day. Last year, I think they released the first game for Penn State being a whiteout on NBC, but that was special for NBC as its first Big Ten game or whatever for the year. I think you'll see one that will probably end up on NBC in prime time is Oregon at Penn State at the end of September. That one's kind of already been determined unofficially, but and you might see a couple more go out, but they haven't had their draft yet, and that's really a major factor in how they determine which games end up on what networks, of course.
Talking with Scott Dochterman from The Athletic. Couple more for you, Doc, before we run out of time. Want to get your thoughts. Tough loss for the men's basketball team. I know you're not on the Iowa beat anymore in the basketball beat. You make your way to Carver from time to time, but being in Iowa City, being obviously living in the corridor, you hear the conversations. You keep an eye on Iowa basketball. Where we go? I mean, you go back to the game against Oregon. They got a 7-footer from Germany that like Michigan's after, a bunch of other programs. Fran's still committed, right? He's still out there recruiting, doing those kind of things. And then you have a fan base that just isn't showing up. Injuries have piled up. Frustration is there. Just an incredibly weird season of Iowa men's basketball. How do you think it concludes after this year, regardless if it's in the Big Ten tournament or not?
Well, it's not real positive off the field. And, I can tell you this, that some of the, people I talk to, just off record, having conversations with, they all expressed I think Beth's got a tough decision to make, meaning what happens with the basketball program, because they know the success that Iowa's had on the court under Fran McCaffrey, which is since 2012, they've been, at least 500 in the Big Ten every year but one. And that's kind of a big note. But you also look at the ticket scans and other things here. I mean, when only 4,700 people show up for Penn State or for Purdue, I mean, the top 10 team Purdue, and that's, a third of the arena. I mean, you've got some problems there. So I don't know how you keep the same leadership in place if you want to change things without the leadership radically changing. And I just don't know that. Why wouldn't you have changed last year? Why would you have to change this year? I don't know all of that. And so I would guess I would be surprised if everybody came back and, everything's fine and we're going to try harder next year. But, things have in the past, I would have said the same thing about some of the football offensive coordinators in the past, right. And that didn't really change either.
Very true, Doc. Very true. With that, I get this question all the time, and it's about the financials. Does it make sense? We know they don't have the basketball NIL funds. People want to spend on football and women's basketball at this point, and you can understand it with the successes of those programs, regardless of who it is. And some of the names that are out there, Darren DeVries, not exactly a dynamic personality. Ben McCollum, these are not guys that are rah-rah guys and trying to kind of rebuild this fan base. And that's a component, either A, financially, what it's going to take to bring in a new coach and the NIL funds if it's going to matter. And secondly, who's that guy that's going to drum up the interest and get men's basketball back to being a thing again?
I don't think you need some sort of, car salesman or, a used car salesman, let's say, that can come up and do jumping jacks in the middle of the arena and get everybody fired up. I don't think you need that. But I think there just needs to be more of a relationship and engagement building that takes place. And that's beyond anybody, whether it's Fran or the coaching staff, the players. It's administrative. It's wholesale. There's so much there that needs to happen that it's, you got to start from ground zero. You got to start over. And that's unfortunate, but it's true. And so whether or not they have a dynamic personality or not, I mean, I don't think anybody would say, TJ has a dynamic personality. He's not PJ Slack, he's not like that. But
he
relates well. Yeah, he relates well to, and of course he wins. That's another big major component. But so I don't think you need PJ in Iowa City as the basketball coach. But what I think you do need is a level of engagement. And I've said this quite a few times, that you look at the things that Iowa basketball has taken away from the fans over the last 10 or so years, starting with the home and homes in state.
Mm-hmm.
That was a level, those were games people paid attention to. Those were games people went to. They were interested in how Iowa competed with Drake, how Iowa State competed with Northern Iowa and all that. Those were taken away in favor of the Big Four Classic, which was also taken away. What did you give them in return? Well, in Iowa's case this year, a lot of bad games that nobody cared about. Southern, Texas A&M Commerce, not Texas A&M, but Texas A&M Commerce, South Carolina Upstate, not South Carolina, but Upstate. Then you take away the PTL, which was, you couldn't have had a better marketing tool than that over the years. You had, it was free. several hundred fans would show up and watch them play summer basketball. Some would get autographs or pictures, and then people would write stories and do videos and talk about it on podcasts and radio, and all that's gone. Well, what did you replace it with? Nothing. There's just the level of engagement has been taken away and hasn't been replaced with anything. So that's in part because of the basketball program, but it's also in part because the administration hasn't done anything with it. That needs to change. So if you don't have PTL in the summer anymore, or shirts and skins before home football games, you got to find ways to get that basketball program in front of people. Now, ultimately you have to win because all of it's just window dressing, but they've won enough to where there should be some equity there, and there just isn't. I mean, their fans are just not interested. Some people think that, well, it's because the women's program's winning. Well, maybe there's a few people who opt for the women's games over the men's. But I think what these numbers have shown us is more people are opting for, I don't even care, over going. And that's the worst possible thing that can happen for Iowa men's basketball.
Scott Dochterman from The Athletic. A big thank you to Doc for joining us here today. We come back on the other side, wrap things up. This is Locked On Hawkeyes. Today's episode of the Locked On Hawkeyes podcast is brought to you by Roy. Attention Hawkeye fans, the future of college sports is here, and it's transparent. Before the Roy app, NIL negotiations often happened under the table. Fans didn't have a clear way to directly support the athletes that they love. Now with Roy, you get to be part of the change and support Hawkeye athletes in the most transparent way possible. Roy, the NIL app allows you to choose the player you want to support, decide how much to contribute, receive exclusive content from the athletes you back, and the best part, if the player transfers, you get your money back. It's a risk-free way to show your support. The Roy app is giving fans control, no more uncertainty. Now you can provide transparent, impactful support and help shape the team and future of college sports with your contributions. Download the Roy app now from the App Store and start backing Hawkeye athletes the way they deserve, with transparency, trust, and a real impact. This is the future of college sports. Join it now by downloading Roy and supporting your favorite players. Trent Condon back with you one final time. Locked On Hawkeyes, and a quick look at what we have coming up on Sunday. The Iowa women's basketball team, 1 o'clock tip-off as they will face off against that incredibly talented UCLA team. We talk about Lauren Betts, but it's not just Lauren Betts. It is the depth that they have. They will go 8-9 deep, as probably as deep of a team as you're going to find in the Big Ten this season, and they played an incredible clip outside of that loss that they had to USC. Playing at a high level, got a nice one as well, a nice win against Illinois earlier in the week. I was going to have to play incredibly well. I think they're going to have to shoot it certainly better than we saw through the first basically 3.5 quarters of the game against Ohio State. This is one where I don't think they can hope to win a slugfest. They're going to have to be able to score at a high level because UCLA, they're going to put points on the board. Iowa doesn't have to be perfect, but has to have a clean game there. And then we wrap up tonight, 7:30, with Oklahoma State in town for the wrestling team. I love this has turned into a little bit of a recently kind of something to look forward to at the end of the season, a non-conference duel against Oklahoma State. Obviously, the history of both of those programs. Little bit surprised. I saw the line was out on the Circus Sports Iowa app. Iowa was a 1-point underdog in this match. I went through kind of group by group, weight by weight. I was a little bit surprised by that. Now we'll also have to see who's going to go. That's always a component to that one, but should be a charged up environment and a pretty cool doubleheader on Sunday. The women at 1 o'clock, 7:30 with the wrestling team. Good 1-2 cap off. And of course, the men's team get the victory against Washington on Saturday. We will be back with you late on Sunday night with the Rapid Reaction podcast to both the women's game and the wrestling meet. We'll have you covered on that front. We'll start to preview the week ahead, as we got a busy one here in front of us. The confluence of everything kind of happening. We got baseball going on. Good weekend for the Iowa baseball team. It could have been a perfect one. An extra inning loss to Notre Dame. They got things started on that front. Take a look at the softball team coming up this week. A little bit more. Also going to talk about the Iowa women's wrestling team and what they did over the weekend. Just a dominating performance down in Indianola out of them in the regional tournament. So a lot to get into. We got you covered all sides of things on the Locked On Hawkeyes podcast. We'll talk to you again tomorrow. Until then, go Hawks.